Hi, I'm Peter Kavanagh, and welcome to a message called The Secret, taken from Philippians 4, verses 10 through to 13. As you'll see, as we begin to read this text, it's the secret of being content. Paul let slip in this passage that he had made an incredible discovery. You know, when people invent things or they discover things in science, Paul had also made a phenomenal discovery in Christ, which was the secret of being content. Now, whether you are a Christian or not, contentment is just wonderful for good mental health and sound well-being. But we're going to discover that contentment as a Christian is not quite the same as contentment for those outside of the Christian faith, but more on that in a minute. Before we read Philippians 4, let me just set it up for you. Paul, in writing Philippians, is in prison. He's in jail. He's sort of under house arrest. It's not quite the dungeon that he'll find himself in a book like 2 Timothy, or perhaps the place he was in Acts 16 when he was imprisoned in the stocks in Philippi, But he is towards the end of the book of Acts, Acts 28, the last couple of verses, we find Paul under house arrest. He's not able to go and preach the gospel. He's there for a number of years under arrest in prison. And in the first century, if you are under such conditions, you're in prison, of course, the guard does not supply you with food. The guard doesn't provide you with, a TV and, leisure, of course, but he doesn't supply you with food or water either. And so the prisoner was entirely reliant on his friends and colleagues to supply his basic life needs. Otherwise, he would have starved to death. Now, as we pick up this reading in Philippians 4, verse 10, Paul is thanking the Philippians because Epaphroditus has just arrived, or arrived recently at least, and was able to supply Paul with money or resources that has enabled him to eat again. That's the context of this story, and that's the context in which Paul finds contentment. Well, that's the background. Let's read it. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. That's not sarcasm. He means that. Indeed, he says, you have been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. So, what can we learn about the vital secret of being content in this passage? Well, maybe you can think of many things. I've thought of 3 or 4. First of all, we discover this, that contentment is not default. Being content is not natural, at least not for most people. It doesn't come naturally for people. And it didn't come naturally even for someone as saintly and as pious as the Apostle Paul. He said this, I have learned the secret of being content. I've had to learn it. It's the Greek word manthano, where we get a derivation, at least anyway, of the word disciple from eventually. He had to be discipled into being content. And so if you're not a naturally content person, I want to say this to you. Well, that's not a surprise, but also don't just put up with that. You're going to have to change that about yourself, and I'm going to have to change that about myself. Being content is part of being a Christian disciple, and it's something that we're going to have to learn. What's interesting is in the Greek text there's an aorist used, which means it's a sudden learning. It's as though Paul might be hinting that he had to learn it one day. There was an occasion where he had to learn it. But whether we learn it in a single day because of a single episode in our life, or whether we learn it over a period of time, or whether, as is probably the case for most of us, we have to go back again and again to this secret of learning contentment, it is something that's not default. It's something that we're going to have to change and become. The second thing I notice in the passage is that this contentment is not learned in a lecture. It's learned in a time of lack. We learn contentment not by having everything and then going to some sermon and listening to an exhortation to be content. That's not how God disciples us. God discipled Paul by taking away that which he felt he really needed. There are so many things that we aspire to be, to have, to possess. Some people aspire, to be successful in their work life. Other people aspire, to be married, or maybe something even in the ministry. But many of these aspirations, many of these yearnings and longings and sometimes lustings are not really things that God is maybe even in. Some of the things that we desire, maybe God doesn't desire them for us. And certainly, maybe not right now. Maybe there's a time when these things will come to pass. But at this particular season of our life, it's not going to be. And so in those seasons, we must learn the secret of being content. And here we discover that the way Paul learned it was simply by not having things. I remember one pastor once said, you really discover what people are like. You really discover their spiritual maturity when they discover that they can't have everything that they want. That's when you find out who people really are. And that's when we find out who we really are. Paul learned the secret of being content by not having the necessary food that he needed. So we're not talking about a desire for a car, a new MacBook, a desire for a husband, or the desire to have some ministry or business opportunity. We're talking about his totally understandable and natural desire to eat. And yet, God didn't permit that just for a short time, in order that he might learn to rely on God and just be content in his relationship with God. If we are not content with our relationship with God, then we're not going to be content about anything. Maybe we haven't understood the gospel at all, or maybe we need to revisit some of the basic tenets of the gospel message. Paul had a similar experience that he relates in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where he had a problem. We don't know what it was. And he asked the Lord to take it away. And the Lord said, I'm not going to take this away because my grace is going to be sufficient for you. And my power will be made perfect in your weakness.